Did you want to say something, ma'am?
I'm Cheryl Cozy, and I'm a psychotherapist in private practice in Atlanta, Georgia. And one of the things that we've been discussing is this issue on a macro level, but I deal with it on a micro level. I deal with the parents that come to me and say, "Hey, I'm not a teacher. I don't know anything about science. I don't know anything about math." But they've been thrust in a role of having to teach their children. The children are on the computer. You think that they're engaging in the lesson, but they're on social media being bullied. We're Monday morning quarterbacking, and we need to be prepared for the next crisis. And that's my concern, is that we're finger pointing and we're blaming this one and blaming that one. And, I recall the Obama administration did have a pandemic response program prepared, and I think it was tossed out by the following administration. But, my concern is going forward. How are we going to be able to prepare teachers to deal with the next crisis? How are we going to be able to prepare parents to deal with their adolescents? That's who I deal with mostly, is adolescents coming in who've had complete personality changes because of the pandemic, because of the social isolation. So, adolescents are already prone to be anxious anyway. And so when you compile a crisis such as this nature on top of that, you have a situation where we have to be prepared. We have to stop finger pointing. We have to say, how can we collectively come together as a society and prepare for the next crisis?
Well, let me respond to what you're saying, because you're speaking some down-to-earth, actionable truth. And not only was the preparedness plan thrown out, the 24 people that knew the most about how to execute were dismissed. So let's throw the plan out and get rid of everybody that knew anything about it. And that's a serious problem, and that has to be remediated as well. You want to say something before we go to break?
Yes, so my name is Christopher Cormier. I'm an associate professor in the School of Education at Loyola Marymount University. I think there's a few things that we're missing from this conversation. So I do agree with most of what folks have said today. But I think that one of the things is that when we think about who was impacted the most, we're often not talking about students with disabilities who were served in special education programs.
Absolutely.
When schools shut down, what happened was that their IEPs, they were pretty much getting nothing. And schools then started trying to scramble to make it happen where the IEPs would say that they would get remote instruction. So the local school districts did a horrible job with managing students with disabilities, and the federal government did not give great oversight. But one thing that I think that we're not having a discussion on is there were some benefits, though, and that were things. So I know that the topic today is on the mishandling of the pandemic, but if we continue to give this deficit narrative of teaching, then we wonder why people do not want to go in the classroom. And so on one hand, we can say that there were students that we realized that were bullied, that they found that being in a remote environment was a much better space for those students. We found that one thing that's often not talked about, teachers of color, who are often expected to take on certain roles in schools. You have a black man, he's expected to deal with all the behavior problems or perceived behavior problems. Your Latina teacher, you're expected to be the translator. That didn't happen in a remote environment. So the same racialized and toxic experiences that people of color have outside of schools, schools are microcosms of society, and they were had in schools. So then if you're a teacher of color and you're going to a Zoom faculty meeting, you could just shut off because you don't have to deal with all the chatter. But I think that the reality is that we just need to be careful with how we're framing this and not looking at it. On one hand, again, students with disabilities weren't served well. On the other hand, there were some positive things that came out of this. And lastly, I'll share that I think that one thing that is problematic is that so many people who are making these decisions, even some folks here, were not teachers. And so we're asking people, I was a teacher before becoming a professor. And so, but we're having people make decisions who were never in the classroom, who are giving these conversations and saying, oh, well, the unions are saying this or the unions are saying that. Well, at the end of the day, teaching is still a career. And even though it's a caring and compassionate field, as a teacher, I still have bills. And that I think that there is a misconception that teachers are supposed to give, and shouldn't receive anything, given that this is also a career that they should be getting some money for as well.
Do you have a story or a question for me? Click the link in the description and tell me what in the world is going on.